Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. I am really excited for today's conversation. Today we're speaking with Dr. Emilie Caspar. She is an associate professor at Ghent University and is a prominent figure in the fields of social and cognitive neuroscience. As the principal investigator of the Moral and Social Brain Lab, her research centers on understanding the mechanisms of human social interactions and the moral judgments that arise from them. Her academic journey, innovative research, and dedication to public science engagement have made her a key contributor to our understanding of moral behavior and social dynamics. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm very fine. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, we were just talking briefly about you're calling in from Brussels today, which is so lovely. I'm really excited to also just learn about so many different places, even in Europe, that I've never been to. If you had to kind of summarize your favorite thing about Brussels, what would it be?
Oh, good question. I think, well, I'm born and raised in Brussels, so I don't know if I'm the most objective to answer, the most objective person to answer, but I really love the fact that, for instance, whenever you take a public transport or when you walk in the streets, you will hear so many different languages with so many people coming from everywhere in the world. That's highly multicultural. You have people with so various backgrounds. I really love it. And actually, for me, it's normal to live in such environments. But when I'm traveling and in other main cities, not necessarily in Europe, but everywhere, in public transport, I hear mostly the same language. And that really strikes me that, yeah, I really see how Brussels is diverse for human beings. And I really love it.
Hmm. I mean, it's something, even as you say that, as I was traveling in Europe, especially in Switzerland, I thought a lot about how when we speak different languages, the way we even understand or communicate some of the ideas that we may have must be
Mhm.
so fundamentally different that even in hearing someone speak something else, you have to be like, okay, wow, we are different enough to where you might be understanding the same thing that I'm seeing differently just because of the words that you have in your brain. But, taking a situation like the United States, where even if people do speak other languages, primarily people only feel comfortable externally speaking in English, I think you miss a lot of that understanding of how diverse people are. What are some of the things
Yeah.
do you think that allow some countries or some areas like Brussels, for example, for people to continue speaking their languages rather than trying to all conform to one?
Yeah, but the thing is that in Belgium, we don't have a single official language. We have three actually: French, Dutch, and German. So there is already a huge diversity in official languages that people can hear or
Mm.
learn. Well, the thing is that in Brussels, that's also the center of the European Commission, NATO. So for sure, you have always people coming from everywhere for more or less short or long periods of time. So many people they don't necessarily have to speak one of the three main languages of the country. Most of the people in Belgium speaks English. So yeah, actually, it's very common in Europe that you anyway have to speak different languages. And as you mentioned, that's always interesting to see how sometimes even between French and English we have a lot of words in common, but sometimes the context in which they are used are totally different.
Mm.
And that I mean, having all these different languages, it brings additional cultural sensitivity, but also different perspectives on how other feels. And indeed, sometimes there are words that doesn't exist in a language or in another. And even when I'm speaking in French, sometimes I'm going to use, for instance, an English word because it represents better what I want to say than the French word.
Mm. I've actually been learning I've been learning Japanese right now, and it's been the first time I've actively been trying to learn a language, and it has been so hard for my brain to kind of get around that. I'm so something I'm always fascinated talking to neuroscientists about is most people study something external, but neuroscientists are the people who study the thing that does the thinking, which is it seems so breaking a fourth wall to be like, I'm going to think about the thing that does the thinking. I'm really
Mhm.
curious before getting into a lot of your work and What if you feel like your research and all the things that you've learned in neuroscience impacts your day to day about how you kind of navigate the world?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I've been thinking quite a lot about this, especially it's also slightly related to my work, but also to the populations that I meet for the research I conduct. Um, I think when you study psychology or when you study the brain with neuroscience, you actually understand better and better why people act the way they do or why they decide to do specific actions or say a few things because that's what you study. You try to understand human behaviors. And actually, now, for instance, we are talking about criminal responsibility or other things like that, I'm more trying to find explanations to all the behaviors I can see because I know they have an explanation considering the brain without necessarily considering like something more general. I don't know if I'm clear in what I'm
Mm,
saying, but I try to rationalize and to find a justification to any behaviors and to understand anyone regardless of what they did. So to put like the emotional parts aside and really rationalize human behaviors. And that really
mm.
influenced the way I see the world, actually.
I mean, there is so, there's so much I want to ask you about what you just brought up there, and I want to try to eventually connect it back to our main conversation, but I have to ask you this because let's say you're confronted with a challenging decision in your own life, and when I'm just curious what your beliefs are on your own personal relationship to free will in that sense of to what extent do you feel like you have control over what you choose to or don't choose to do, rather than how much of it is just some brain kind of process going on.
Yeah, that's a good one because free will is also a huge topic of debate in
Yeah.
neuroscience, the extent to which it truly exists or not. And the thing is that as neuroscientists, we know that actually most of the decisions we make actually they're always caused by something else. I do not mean that I strongly believe in determinism, that everything for sure is predetermined. That's not what I want to say. But the decisions I'm going to make are, of course, influenced by a lot of factors that are not always conscious. Because sometimes your decisions or your perception of things or events are influenced by past experience that you had that may not be fully conscious in your brain. So yeah, and that's interesting because when I try to make big decisions, I always also try to feel my instinct. And I'm not talking here about more the emotional part, but more like I'm somehow guessing that my brain knows better than my like conscious perception what I should do because the brain has all the information. So I would rather follow my instinct for some of the main thing. And that's actually why I started doing the research I'm currently doing. Because what I'm doing, especially like studying former genocide perpetrators with neuroscience method, no one has done this before. And many people or funding agencies somehow tried to discourage me, thinking that it was impossible. But I was sure that I had something there. And I did follow my instinct for that. And that's something that I'm doing quite a lot, actually.
Because I think what you're bringing up here really does connect to this morality theme. Because oftentimes when we think about wanting to place judgment or blame, and this comes also a lot back to school as well, is there seems to be this narrative that, okay, if you're doing something wrong, or if you've made some mistake in your life, or let's not even call it a mistake, just you've done X decision, there seems to be a desire to be like, you made this decision because you're lazy, or you made this decision because you didn't want to, or you wanted to impose evil on others, or whatever reason. Sometimes it's hard to simply give the empathy to another to be like, maybe we don't fully understand what it is that's going on in your space to make
Mhm.
that decision, the one that you felt like you needed to do in that moment. I
Mhm.
feel this is something that's really been sticking out the more I travel, where I've been shocked by how a singular decision put into the context of five different societies can be viewed in complete opposite ways. I mean, and it's always fascinating to me of how no matter I don't know, you can be so assured in a decision that you made in a particular context, but taken out, all of a sudden you may have made the biggest mistake you want. And so
Mhm.
connecting this back to the brain, I think, gives it some sort of general, like you're able to then generalize it outside of just a social context of what actually happens internally when you make a decision that you think is right or wrong. So I guess that's a great place to start then, because when people typically think about morality, it's usually thought of in this philosophical sense, what is right, what is wrong, but to connect it back to the brain is really fascinating. What was your
Mhm.
journey like to kind of even put those two together? What was the
Mhm.
initial kind of thought or question that made you want to be like, oh, how do I put these two together? And then where did it kind of trickle down from there?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, I think it comes from. So I had a strong interest in neuroscience, in the brain, and trying to understand people's behavior. But while, yeah, I did study psychology and neuroscience, I was also very interested in more criminal behaviors. Um, because for me, that's always interesting because, I mean, we are in societies, we have to live together, we have to behave well with others, but there are people who seems to be less influenced by such social constructs or social needs, and they will rather transgress and hurt other people emotionally, verbally, physically. And I was very intrigued by actually how is that possible, and I wanted to understand better, more like what's the neural basis of morality and why it's not, for instance, something automatic in and similar in all human beings. And so, for instance, when I was doing my PhD in neuroscience, I also did follow a 2 years degree in forensic sciences and criminology because I really wanted to combine the two together. And that's also thanks to this that I have started working more on obedience to authority, genocides, and such big questions.
Hmm. Wow. I mean, there's so many questions. I mean, just before I want to kind of provide the context. Growing up, was a terrible student, and so I was often the one who was in trouble all the time, being told to kind of be quiet, be obedient, don't talk out of turn, don't move out of turn. And so this is something that has resonated with me for so much of my life of trying to understand. I've always been fascinated by the people who are kind of on the quote unquote wrong side of history because I was always like, what make, why did they end up there? And I always felt a little bit more drawn to those people than the ones who are always the kind of fat, amazing, always taking the righteous actions. And so there was something really interesting about that. So I guess before moving forward, I wanted to kind of clarify what is a moral decision when it comes to the brain? How does the brain determine or how does it react differently to something it considers moral versus not?
Yeah. So actually, that's a very like the question is simple, but the answer is very complex
Mm,
because morality is also a social construct. So, what we may consider being moral in Western cultures, for instance, may not necessarily appear as moral in other cultures, and the other way around is true as well. So, when we speak about morality, the main thing first is to define actually the perception that we have. What I call an immoral behaviors may not be perceived as such in other cultures, for instance. And it's true that the literature in neuroscience, and that's why I want to contextualize this, is mostly focusing on people from Western countries. So when you see literature in morality in neuroscience, that is of course mostly written with the perspective of Western scientists on Western populations. But as human beings, there are also some generalization of morality. Like overall, all societies agree that it's not a good thing to hurt another people, especially, for instance, in exchange for monetary reward. There are concepts, moral concepts, that are more broadly accepted. And actually, when it comes to the brain, there are different brain regions that are involved into weighting what is moral, immoral, and how to compute this into a behavior. You have brain regions, for instance, that will take the perspective of others, such as the TPJ, temporal parietal junctions. You have brain regions that will process the emotional or physical pain of the person that will suffer or not from the consequences of your actions, like brain regions like the anterior cingulate cortex, the anterior insula. So actually, this is a very complex network that will weight all the different aspects associated with your moral decision making. But even though, for instance, in neuroscience, we have some meta-analysis, that's where several studies are combined together to see if there are some commonalities. Um, we don't know for sure if there is a single pathway towards morality, and probably for sure it's not the case. But in neuroscience, even though we may find specific brain regions associated with it, we are also have the limitation of technology. I mean, we have amazing material to look at what is happening in the brain, but for sure, in 100 years, I think what we now know regarding this will also change or be very much more precise.
Hmm. So is there a particular part of the brain that is responsible for judging whether something is moral or not?
Yeah, that's a complex answer as well, because there is not that many studies who take the that takes the perspective of the culture and the social construct and how this influence brain regions. So while we know that there are some brain regions associated with the weighting of values, reward processing, social context, and so on, the way exactly culture influenced this and how is not perfectly defined
Hmm.
at the moment.
Huh. So interesting. So do other animals, or a better question maybe is which animals show signs of comprehending this form of morality as well?
Yeah, actually, there's a lot of studies showing that other animals, non-human animals, are able to show pro-social behaviors towards other. I don't know if I can speak about morality here because, as mentioned, since morality is a very specific social constructs, we don't know if actually animals, non-human animals, have this perception of morality. But there are several studies that have been done on monkeys or other big mammals, but also on rodents, showing that actually they can help other animals from the same species. For instance, there are some studies with rodents showing that whenever they can choose between different situations, and in one of the situation they can see another rodent which is in danger or in pain, they are going to some of them they are going to help that other rodent.
Huh.
So actually, this is not only something human to help others, and perhaps this is related to evolution. I mean, we have to protect our own species. That's the way we can see it. So it makes also sense actually to observe it in other animals.
Hmm. But and that's interesting, where moralities only can exist when you have a conception of like this is a society. I must fit into a society. Most animals don't build societies like that. I mean, do they?
No, it really depends on the species. You have some animals who lives like in bigger groups that are organized based on different social structures. Some of them are hierarchical, like let's take the bees, for instance, or the chimps. But you also have animals that are not living in big groups where there is they are less confronted to these social structures. But it's
Hmm.
interesting to see that even in the world of non-human animals, you can see also social organizations in some of them.
This is a really interesting concept though, because it begs the question of like, if I lived in isolation, does morality like cease to exist? So if I was in the middle of nowhere where none of my decisions impacted, at the very least, other humans, and they only impacted the trees around me or the animals, does morality does your brain no longer react in that way?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. That experimentally, that's a bit hard to
Yeah, yeah, just
and to study. But yeah, that would be crucial actually to trying to understand this better.
Hmm. I wanted to now connect this to the book that you just recently released, which congratulations.
Thank
It's about obedience. Can you remind me the name of your book one more time? I'm so
Yeah, so it's just following orders,
Hmm.
atrocities, and the brain science of obedience.
Hmm. What was the inspiration for writing that book, and how long was the process, and what was it like for you?
Yeah. Okay, that was a long process. Um, Actually, so to go back to the first point, so yeah, I always been interested, as I mentioned, with the study I combine in neuroscience, but also criminology, and understand better wrongdoings overall. And actually, when I was studying criminology, I sometimes watched uh, criminal trials on television just to understand better the process. And one day I was watching a kind of um, very interesting documentary. And it was about a kindergarten teacher who had hired contract killers to kill her husband in order to have the life insurance. And during the trials, she received a longer prison sentence than the contract killers. And actually, it started to trigger many questions in my brain. And I did wonder um, how is it possible? Like, yeah, justice consider that she initiated the intention, so she's more responsible than the contract killers who executed the actions. But still, I don't know if she really felt more responsible and who is actually taking responsibility for what is going to happen. So actually, I started questioning the power of hierarchical chain and who, when one person send orders and another one execute orders, who is feeling responsible for what is happening. Yeah, I don't know if you can still receive me because I see a weird.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Um, And so that criminal case actually triggered my whole study on obedience. And I really wanted to understand what is happening in the brain when people follow orders and how can we explain that people can commit atrocities when they follow orders. So I started working on these questions, but for the book, I truly believe that this is a very, I mean, that's a scientific question, but that's also a very societal question. And I think that when something is deeply, like a question is deeply ingrained in the society, it should be shared widely. And that's actually how I decided to write this book. It's in the format of a trade book, so it's accessible to more like the general population, even with no specific background in neuroscience or psychology. Because I think that this topic raises awareness regarding the danger of obedience, what it does to the brain. And I think this should really be shared massively. And that's how I decided to write the book. Actually, when I started writing it, it was during the COVID pandemic because, yeah, as many people, I had less work because I could not access the lab, I could not access human participants. So for my research, I was totally blocked. And actually, I decided that it was a good moment to start writing it. It took about 2 years, but of course, I was not writing on it full time. And I finished it, yeah, about slightly more than a year ago.
How did that feel after you finished?
Wow. Yeah, the feeling of accomplishment was huge, but it was not really the end because even if I was writing the final word, I still had to go through a lot of different processes, like editing, like reviewing and stuff like that with the publishing house. But yeah, this is quite of, yeah, it really feels like a huge accomplishment and a lot of
Yeah.
work.
You get, I think, I'm working on writing something right now. It's my first time ever, my first kind of process. And I think at the end of the day, when you look at that book, however long it is, 100 pages, 150, 200 pages, it looks like it's not that big. It's actually physically very small, but you
Mm,
know how much time went into
Yeah.
the research, went into the talking to the people, writing it, editing, the whole it's so fascinating how something so physically small could have taken so much time. It's actually
Yeah,
quite magnificent in that way.
yeah, it actually culminates 8 years of research. And I mean, yeah, so many like human encounters, research issues,
Yes.
and the way it is translated in the book. And also the difficulty is like when you're a scientist, of course, you're used to have to be very precise in what you write, like each word. And when you have to translate this into a trade book, that's very different, the process, because you still have to be very precise, but you have to somehow not ignore, but uh, ease a bit what you are saying and decomplexify what you have found. And that's very difficult and sometimes a bit frustrating as well, because you have to be more general regarding the results of your research. And yeah, that's a different process, actually. That's very interesting.
Like, because you typically do research academic writing, and this kind of was a little different from that. Huh.
Yeah, I only did academic writing until the book, actually. Well, I was doing things for the media here and there, but not that much. That's the first time I was writing an entire book for a general audience.
Hmm. I guess now to actually get into the core of this concept of obedience, it's something I think it's interesting because after I've left the establishment of school, because I run my own business, I do a lot of things with my own autonomy. I haven't felt too obedient since. I felt like I've been able to take all that disobedience I was showing in the beginning, and now that I've removed the establishment, it's no longer called disobedience. It's just called me living my life the way I want to. There's no force that I'm disobeying. So
Mhm.
the question I guess I wanted to start with is what is obedience, first of all? I mean, what is that? What does that look like? What is that? What is it?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for the question. Because of course you can see obedience in very different contexts, and I'm not claiming that obedience is always a problem. Yeah, the book focus on the very problematic of obedience, when actually it leads people to do things that are very immoral, or when they hurt other human beings. But actually, I also believe that we also needed to work in our societies. I mean, as human beings, we evolve in so huge and highly connected societies. If we don't have rules that we accept to follow, that's not going to work. We're just too many. So you can consider obedience also sometimes as a good thing. Like, yeah, I follow the rules of the society. I respect when I'm driving, I do respect the rules. When I'm interacting with other people, I do respect the rules. When I'm at school, I try to follow the rules, but it's okay. But yeah, in the book, I mostly focus on obedience, when actually I'm surprised that people continue to obey whenever it involves strongly hurting other human beings. Because, and I'm going to go back to my comments about evolution. I mean, we are supposed to protect our own species. And as human beings and as being animals as well, technically our biology should drive us to protect other members of humanity, other other human beings. And still, when we see what is happening in the world, like wars, genocides, whatever is happening ongoing, and many people justifying this by obedience, I it makes me wonder, how is that possible that obedience, which is something that we develop probably to succeed in as a species in our evolution, also allows us to kill or to strongly hurt members of our own species.
So how the same thing that may have evolved to help us can also damage us. Hmm.
Yes, exactly.
So I'm really curious what you think about this. So I wanted to so your definition of obedience, from what I heard, is the acceptance and following of a set of rules.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
When I think about obedience, I find the following of rules to me not to be considered obedience when the choice to follow the rule is kind of made on your own. So like the driving on the road, I think is a great example where me not choosing to drive on the other side of the road is not because I want to follow the rule. It's because I don't want to crash into the incoming traffic. So I'm going to drive on my side so that I can stay alive. I wouldn't consider that a form of obedience. But a situation I would call a form of obedience is like standing in a line when you want to move a little bit, but you're not allowed to, and you have to. So doing something that is against your will, that you haven't actually rationalized the reason for. To me, that would be a form of obedience, not following something that you think makes sense. I don't know. Is there a difference between those two or not really?
Actually, I was more thinking of an intermediary example. I do agree that driving on the other side of the road, you do it not because you follow rules, because you just want to stay alive. That I totally agree. But for instance, when you have those stop signals, I know they are very frequent in the US, and where actually you have to mark the stop to look if other drivers are coming, and then you are authorized to go. Actually, that's very interesting because most of the time you have to stop and you can have a fine if you don't, even though there are no other drivers. And you could also consider that those stop signals, for instance, will not have a huge importance. I mean, if you see that there is no other driver, right, well, you just don't continue. Here, of course, I'm not mentioning something that you should or should not do. I mean, that's important to follow those rules. But for instance, this one, sometimes you don't have to mark the stop to save your life, for instance. And there are these situations where actually you could somehow, while you are driving, question to what extent you want to follow the rules perfectly or not.
Hmm. I think that's a great one. I feel this. It's actually I have a funny example to give of this. So the first day I got to Japan, I'm staying in kind of a residential area, so it's not a lot more just people who are working, just very just people who live here. And one of the first days, I was the size of the road maybe I would say is like 20 feet, like really, really short. It is not far at all, but there's a signal and there's like a walking sign. There is no car coming in either direction for at least 1 minute away, like for like half a mile, you can look in both directions. There is no car coming, but everybody is just waiting for the sign to give them so they can cross. And I just came from New York, and I knew there is no chance people are waiting for more than 0.2 seconds in that situation. And it was
But
just so, yeah.
that's actually very funny because just in Belgium, we have a huge cultural difference between Belgium is a very small country, but we have mostly a French part and a Dutch part, where the culture is sometimes considered very different. And this is a huge difference. I come from Brussels, such as in New York. We see a red light, we are pedestrians. No way we wait if there is no one. I will just go. And I'm working in Ghent, where actually I did the same when there were no cars, so no dangers. And I sometimes have other pedestrians yelling at me because
Oh,
I'm not authorized to do it because I should follow the rules. And that's where I see a huge cultural difference with that within the same small country. And when I was in Japan also in March this year, a couple of months ago, and I had exactly this, that's a very good example as well.
yeah. And it's so interesting how we kind of embody these. I had an episode. Now it's bringing me these memories of, I think it was maybe episode 26 or 27, really early in the show, where I had spoke to someone who talked a lot about like the panopticon. She was also a an ethical philosopher, and she talked this idea about how in some societies you embed within yourself this kind of big brother who's constantly looking at you, making sure you're doing the right or wrong things. And in countries where that's a lot more intense, you would actually stop yourself from even crossing the road when it makes no sense to not. And then there's also the opposite where you have no kind of regard for other humans and you're like, I'm just going to go whenever I want to go, which does happen in New York often. So, I mean, I guess my question is how does one kind of find the balance between both of these? And then we can kind of get into what happens in the brain when we follow rules. So yeah, so how does one first kind of find a balance between these?
Yeah, that's actually very difficult. And I think that's also it somehow it joins the question of morality because that's also a social construct. Like as we mentioned with like pedestrians stopping at the red signals or not. some people would consider it as a good thing to show that we don't have to comply to rules whenever there is no sense with it. I mean, like immediate danger with other cars around, for instance. While for other people, you should be obedient to those rules regardless the situation or the context. So it's also very different for that. But sorry, I just had a blank in my argument
No,
regarding
it's fine.
uh,
Okay.
what I was going to say. Can you just repeat
Yeah, yeah.
the
I mean, no, no, no,
story?
totally okay. No, no, it's totally fine. It's I have this happen all the time. But the question was basically when you have both of these extremes where you can simply have no
Oh,
regard for
yeah, the
people and the
balance.
other, how do you find the balance? Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, that's a critical societal question as well, because, for instance, and we will, I guess, discuss that later, but in the book, I work a lot with former genocide perpetrators. And actually, they all mention, most of them mention obedience as the main reason for participation. And we may wondering retrospectively, but why the hell do they use obedience as an argument? They should have disobeyed. But at the same time, at that moment, with all the social context around, that was just normal, and that was even the good thing to do, to obey those orders, because they truly believed that by exterminating another part of the population, that was the moral the moral or the right thing to do. So obedience is very socially relevant. And my rule for that would be that whenever it hurts another person, while it's not necessary, people should not obey. But that's also very different because very difficult, because when you've got years of hateful propaganda towards other human beings, and that you're led to believe that this is the right thing to do, that's very difficult. And here, for instance, I'm going to mention also the job of the military. For instance, I'm not a military I'm not a military personnel, but I've did work for some studies with them. And I found this particularly difficult because, for instance, they have international regulations that allows them to disobey direct orders received from a superior if the orders involve to commit a crimes or a delict. But
Mm,
they should not question morality. They have to do, because it's their military duty, actions that goes against their moral values. That's why many of them, they have moral injuries or PTSD, for instance, afterwards. But they should only disobey when it's a crime or a delict. And for them, balancing between these different situations, I mean, defining what is moral and what is legal is not always easy as well. And I'm actually trying to see how we can help people balancing more between these different options. But my perspective in the book, and it's very important to admit it when I mention immoral obedience, is also my own perspective of Western culture not hurting another person, but within a context and where you had propaganda, dehumanization, discrimination, history of political instability, economic instability, and so on, I can also understand why some people choose the path of obedience.
mm. And so connecting this to the neuroscience perspective, when somebody is obedient, what happens in the brain versus when someone disobeys? Are there differences?
Yeah, so actually we did a lot of studies with neuroimaging techniques such as fMRI and EEG, and we used a quite simple experimental design where actually people have the choices between two actions. One is to send a mildly painful electric shock to another person in exchange for a small monetary reward, or
Ah,
another button where they don't. And actually, we put them in the situation where either they are free to decide what to do, they don't receive any instructions, it's their own decision. And we contrast this with a condition where they receive direct orders from the experimenter to press the shock or the no shock button. And actually, we compare what is happening in the brain when they do exactly the same actions, but one of these actions was decided freely, and the other action was
mm,
actually following an order. And what is very interesting is that we found that there are several neurocognitive processes associated with different brain regions that are impacted when people follow orders, while they do exactly the same actions when they're acting freely. For instance, we have seen that obeying orders decreases activity in empathy-related brain regions when they send the painful shock to the person in front of them. So
Hmm.
empathy in neuroscience is the fact that, so for instance, when you feel pain, it's going to activate specific brain regions. And when you see other people in pain, it will activate similar brain regions. And that's why, what is empathy? That's the fact that you have these shared neural activations that allows you to understand the pain of others. And that's something that is also shared by non-human animals. So it's very deeply biologically ingrained. But interestingly, when you send a mildly painful shock to another person and you see the physical reaction of that person, activity in those brain regions is reduced when people follow orders compared to when they're acting freely. And it actually suggests that when people follow orders, they process less, the brain processes less the pain, the intensity of the pain that they send to the other person. And we have also seen that activity in brain regions, for instance, associated with the perception of feeling guilty for an action and its outcome, is also reduced when people follow orders compared to when they are acting freely. So actually,
Hmm.
it looks like obedience has a strong impact on how our brain processes information, and these processes are also involved in pro-social decisions or moral decisions. And that may actually explain why people or how people are able to commit atrocities when they follow orders, because their brain does not processes the information of the victims, of their own guilt, or on their perception of being responsible in the same way as when they're free to decide.
So interesting. Okay, a couple questions. One, does morality play a role in either of these examples that you gave? Were the participant asked whether they felt how they felt, whether they acted morally or not? Did that play a role?
So, yeah, there are two answers to that question. The first one is that all the studies that I report were made in this moral context where people have to choose to hurt another person in exchange for a monetary reward. So, for instance, I haven't done this task on purely neutral task where people press buttons and only letter A or letter B is going to pop on the screen, for instance. So perhaps we may say that in other non-moral context, the brain will perhaps react differently, but that I don't know. But most of the time, at the end of the study, we ask them to report how moral they consider these decisions were. And for instance, we have observed that for those who truly believe that sending shocks to another person in exchange for money is very immoral, most of the time they tend to send less shocks to the other person or to disobey more frequently the orders of the experimenter. And this
Mm.
is something that we have observed quite a lot. So it's not the only factor, but it seems that one's own perception of morality is going to change a lot their behaviors. But interestingly, we haven't found that this influences how the brain reacts. So it may influences the behavior, but at the moment, we haven't found precisely how this perception of morality influences how the brain reacts in situation of obedience.
Whoa, that is quite interesting. What about how much each participant needed the money?
Yeah, so this is also something we investigate. And the thing is that the monetary reward they received in exchange for the shock was 5 cents. I mean, euro cent, but that's roughly the same in US dollar, I think. So it's very small. So, and it was decided on purpose because, of course, there are some people who told us, oh, if you had given more money in exchange for the shock, I would have sent more. Yeah, well, but that was not the point. 5 cents. And when I designed this study, I really believed that 5 cents would never be sufficient for someone to send a shock to another human being. Actually, I was quite wrong because people tend to send quite a lot of shocks to the other person in front of them. But for some people, it does play a role because they can earn an extra €3 or €4, something like $3 at the end of the study, in addition to the basic remunerations. But most of the time, it's not one of their main arguments, but it really depends from one person to another.
Mm. I guess like something I'm really interested to see is what. So let me, I might be saying this wrong, but I'm going to try saying it again. So what this study looked at, and in general, is given the option between obedience and disobedience, the same action, no, given the option between someone freely choosing something versus someone choosing it by listening to someone, what are the differences? I'm curious what the differences would be if for the same action, someone had to disobey certain rules to take that action, and then in another set, different rules were given. So actually obeying would be doing that same decision. In that sense, is there a so because in the previous one you looked between freely choosing something and obeying. What about the difference between obeying and disobeying?
Yeah, so actually, this is something we have started to look at. But this is more an ongoing line of research.
Mm,
So we did some studies with civilians and military participants, where we tried to understand what is happening in the brain when people actually refuse orders. And I've also done that very recently in Rwanda, where I also did this task, but with actual former genocide perpetrators and rescuers, because the rescuers are people who truly risk their own life, disobeyed orders, and truly risk their own life to rescue threatened human beings. So I'm still processing most of this data. That will probably be the topic of the second book whenever I find time for this.
exciting.
But we have already observed that there are different brain regions that are involved, and empathy, and notably the empathy ones. We have observed that those, for instance, when you obey an order that hurt another person, so it's going to activate activities in empathy-related brain regions. And you have some people that are going to have bigger activations, more important activations in those brain regions when they process the pain of the person in front of them. They are more sensitive to the pain of others. And actually, we have found correlations, like those people who have these bigger activations when they witness the pain of others whenever they obey an order, they are going to disobey much more overall later on. So
Mm,
um, it looks like, but that's one of the process only. There will be several others, but that's one of the main processes that help people resisting because they really their brain processes really the pain that they cause to others.
interesting. I guess something I'm really curious about obedience, and I want to eventually connect this conversation into education. But what I'm thinking about is, as you go up the chain of command, at the
Mhm.
bottom, I feel like people it's very much clear who you're obeying. Okay, I'm obeying my manager, I'm obeying my leader, whatever. But as you get higher and higher up and it becomes a little bit more murky, I think some people sometimes may feel that they're obeying maybe their God or they're obeying some ideology that like isn't necessarily a direct person, but it's something even larger than a human. Are there differences between these type of influences, or does it still impact the brain the same?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So for other entities such as God, we have never tested that experimentally. But what we have done, notably with the military population, is that we have contrasted the type of people giving orders. And in some of them, it was a regular civilian experimenter, and in another one, it was a higher ranked military officer.
Mm,
And actually, we observed that the brain reacted exactly in the same way whenever military personnel were receiving orders from a civilian experimenter or a higher ranked military officer. And it doesn't mean that in a real situation, they are going to be obedient in the same way towards these two types of authority figures. What it does mean, I think, is that whenever someone accepts to follow an order, whatever the reason is, then the brain is influenced in the same way.
mm. So connecting this now, I guess, to learning, because we can see how obedience does make this difference in empathy and understanding. I don't know if you've looked at it, but if you haven't, I'm curious what your hypothesis is. Do you think there's an impact on obedience and perhaps learning, or like the ability to be open enough to actually, have information either just get stuck in there?
Yeah, sorry, perhaps just more clarifications on that one. You mean like obeying teachers to learn
Yeah,
or
I'm really curious, like what, in the same way, the chance of you actually inflicting pain may change. What
Mhm.
about, I mean, I would say the more obedient you feel like a student feels like they must be in school, they may inflict harm even on themselves of just like, I'm not going to listen, I'm going to, I'm just going to go out of my way to act like I'm not
Mhm.
going to listen to you, or be obedient and still internally have conflict. But so in that sense, do you feel like there might be a difference there as well?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's something I would like to test actually in the future because there are also some people who have explained that why we are so obedient overall, even when we should not, is also part of our educations because we learn to follow rules, we learn to obey our parents, teachers, and so on. So actually, that may be very interesting to study. And that's also the contrast here because I'm studying obedience to orders that should be disobeyed from a moral perspective. But for instance, when a teacher's orders to do some homework or to finalize work or whatever, technically I guess most people consider that this is something that is good for the society, like forcing people to study, to have access to education and things like that. So I don't know if the brain would react in the same way. And the thing is that technically I hope not, because for instance, if we consider that obeying orders, as I've shown in my studies, reduces different processes that are involved in decision making. Actually, what we hope with education and when kids are at school is that they would feel more agency regarding what they are studying and really take the lead over what they learn and their education. We don't want this to be a passive process. We really want people to do it. And that's actually a question I also have with when people set rules for themselves, like people who have very strict routines, for instance, somehow they give orders to themselves. But we don't expect that this is going to be a passive process where the brain just reduce its own involvement. That should technically be the opposite, but I haven't tested that experimentally. That's for future work.
That's a really interesting example too. When a person sets their own rules up and they follow that, is that also a form of obedience? Yeah, I think like there are so many different forms of obedience that I think they would, I think I'm curious to see if they would, if the brain would respond differently to those different types of obedience.
Mhm.
Huh.
Yes, that's ongoing work or future
Yeah,
work.
really cool. I mean, now that you run this entire lab, I mean, there's probably so much research that we can look forward for the future and different things. What do you envision to be the future of the moral and social lab?
Yeah, that's a good one because actually when I did all this
Social brain.
research, I was on my own. I was a PhD student, I was a postdoc, and now I run a lab with 15 people. I mean, they not all of them work on obedience per se, but they all work on morality and similar questions. So yeah, I think that's going to give a huge boost to these research topics for sure. And actually, the future is a quite good question because, with the populations I'm accessing to conduct research, it's very unusual in neuroscience, like military prisoners, former genocide perpetrators in Rwanda or in Cambodia. These are things that no one does in neuroscience. And I have a colleague who once told me, with those populations, you did something that experienced researchers may have considered after 30 years of career. But I'm a PI since only 3 years, and I'm actually wondering a lot, okay, but what am I going to do next? Because I have the feeling that I mean, there are still many ongoing questions. And for sure, continuing with very special populations or going beyond the purely Western world, which is for me a huge problem, that should definitely be something that we will continue doing. But I actually don't know. Most of the time, when we do one of the research project, we come up with more questions that with answers. So I'm going to follow the flow of the results that we're going to see to then define what's going to be next, probably.
Hmm. I guess one of the last questions I have for you, which I'm really curious to hear, is I think from even what you've explained, you've taken a lot of autonomy throughout your life to go and, rather than just to work, to really start this lab and kind of lead it in all these amazing ways. Wh- As someone who is an academic, what would you say is kind of the big picture question that you would really like to tap into before your time on this planet ends? Like what are you really searching for?
Ah, oh, very interesting one and a very not easy one. Um, yeah, well, big picture, if I dream, I would find some of I would say brain recipe, but that's a weird a weird wording association. Uh, but yeah, I would say brain recipe for peace. How to
Hmm.
make people not sensitive anymore to intergroup biases. Like everyone sees all human beings are the same. People stop fighting. People stop. I mean, it's very difficult. And that's also why I started to study rescuers during genocides, because these are people who did not fall prey to propagandas. They just did something else. And if everyone would act it in the same way, we would not have wars, we would not have genocides, we would not have some authoritarian regimes. And so I'm really trying to understand how they differ from others and what can we learn from them that could be adapted to finally be in peace.
Mm. And it's really interesting that you approach this question from the neuroscience perspective, because I feel like I have met a lot of people who this conference that I was in Switzerland for was actually about peace and liberation. And it was really interesting that a lot of the academics there came from different backgrounds. Like some of them came at it through a spiritual lens, or some of it came at a lot of people came at it through an education lens. But to kind of approach it from actually studying the brain itself, I think is a really interesting twist that makes this perspective very unique. Have you ever thought about like teaching or kind of incorporating some of the things that you're finding back into education or into some sort of like spiritual teachings, perhaps even?
So, at least education, this is something I'm trying to do at the moment. I'm trying to create a comics for kids that depicts the stories of rescuers to really show
Ah,
that, because most of the books for kids they depict like the Marvel or the DC comics, they depict people who do the right things, but they all have superpowers, abilities. And I think for me, it's a problem. It's a problem because it gives the impression that only whenever you have superpowers, supernatural powers, then you can do something right or good for the society, which is actually not the case. The rescuers are very good examples that very ordinary humans are able to do things that goes beyond everything. And I'm trying to collect at the moment testimonies from rescuers from everywhere in the world to translate this into a comic books for kids that could be used for education, to really show, to provide role models that are accessible and that are actually realistic. So that's one of the projects at the moment.
that seems lovely. I'm really excited. I love children's books. Like just I feel like the artwork, so much of it is very important. And you said it's a comic, so I'm definitely really excited to see it. Yeah, do you have a name for your main character?
No, not yet. No, I think I'm not going to have a main character because I really want to also share this feeling of shared humanity, like humanity as
Mm.
only one thing. So the book will be composed of real stories from rescuers, but from very various locations in the world. So not one people with only one skin color or one trait, like various people from various cultures, ethnicities, whatever, who did extraordinary actions to help others. So I really want to have this perspective in the book.
Hmm. Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'd love to definitely, when you end up releasing that, just please let me know. I'd love to get my
Sure.
hands on that. But